Alison Webb, and I'm Head of Careers Employability Enterprise across at BGU. And at BGU, within our department, we cover quite a lot of different areas. So we do the Careers Employability curriculum, we offer Careers and Employability one-to-one sessions, and also have a real interest in enterprise as well. So we have the BG Futures Enterprise Centre, where we look after 15 businesses in there. So quite a wide range of areas that we get involved with. We also have different projects that we get involved with. So as well as our students, we work with unemployed adults and have had quite a lot of projects working with employers as well, looking at their skills needs. Okay, so in terms of me, I started back in 1994, and that actually is a picture in the very early days when I was a careers advisor. And my interest in gender and career choice, I think, definitely started back then. It was very evident, you know, young people coming in to see me, very stereotypical in their choices. I'd sit there day after day. In those days, we did 8 careers interviews a day, and all the boys would come in and say, you know, I want to be a motor mechanic or a bricklayer. And all the girls would come in and say, I want to be a nursery nurse or a hairdresser or a beautician. It was very gender biased in terms of their career choice. And I kind of thought, okay, is there anything we can do about this? Is there any kind of practice we can put into place that might be useful? And maybe quite naively, I set up visits to, at the time called North Links College. We put boys into nursery nursing and into beauty and hair, just to think, well, okay, it gives them a broader perspective. And then the girls went into motor vehicle at the time and into bricklaying and construction. Did it do any good? I have no idea. I don't think we particularly measured it at the time, but it was, you know, some sort of attempt to open up young people's eyes to other areas. So I suppose in terms of those individual careers interviews, we were kind of thinking, you know, actually in terms of career choice and gender, did it make any difference? I doubt it. You know, a 40-minute careers interview, it's very difficult to influence all those years of maybe that kind of gender history. And what I suppose, as we still do, what we talk to young people about is their strengths, their abilities, and that is very much the point in time that they're at. And those strengths and what they say they enjoy clearly has been influenced by so many things over a number of years. So have things got better? Well, possibly not hugely, slightly, in terms of those sort of stereotypical career choices. I think not hugely. There are some improvements in terms of perhaps women's representation in the FTSE 250, for example, if we looked at something like that. So the number of HR directors in those companies has gone up hugely. So they're about 63% women. Company secretaries, 54%. But actually, when we're looking at things like finance directors in the FTSE 100, it's 16%. And when we're looking at things like chief information officers, that's 12%. So there's still very much gender roles in those kind of companies, in those directorships. Does it matter? Well, I think the thing we've always recognised is that is quite a loss of human capital both ways. And certainly I think the majority of us would probably agree that, you know, a diverse workplace is a stronger one. So there is a problem, and there still is, in terms of this lack of a mix. Locally, the situation in these different sectors, you know, again, there's a real difference there. So science, engineering, production, males, you know, severely outweigh females in those areas. In IT, nursing, females much stronger representation than males. So again, there's a loss of that human capital there. Bricklayers, interestingly enough, there are some females in the East Midlands who are bricklayers, but about 100 out of 10,000. Slightly better with painter and decorators, probably again not surprising because the environment is different, isn't it? Maybe painters and decorators, quite a number of them working in people's homes. It's a bit different to working as a bricklayer on a building site. So probably not too many surprises there that there's that huge difference. In terms of subjects, this again, is such a shame really that there's less of a mix. So males in physics, 77.8 compared to 22.2 females. Biology, bit of a swing the other way, more popular with females. Computer science, and that's the one that is probably shows the biggest gender difference, 88.2% male versus 11.8% female. So many years of this background and still this interest in it, but can we do anything? Should we do anything? I think some of the attempts that are made are useful, but perhaps don't have a huge amount of impact. And a year or so ago, I read this article, which really started to get me thinking. So it's by a lady called Gina Rippon, and she's a neuroscientist, and she started to explain really the differences between male and female brains. And I thought, maybe there's something here that could be useful to share with young people. So I went on and read her book, and it's inspired me now to start my PhD in this area, because I think it is absolutely fascinating. If you're interested in reading more, this is her book from a year or so ago, The Gendered Brain. Really, really interesting read. And there's another one, just slightly different perspective, but along the same lines, called The Gender Mosaic. So again, those are two really good reads if you're interested in finding out more about this. And that's Gina Rippon, so she works at Aston University, and I'm really hoping she's initially said she would do some work with us in Lincolnshire around perhaps developing curriculum packs and looking at if there's some materials that we could perhaps have a bit more of an influence on young people. So just to start with a couple of definitions. So I suppose when we're talking about sex, we're talking commonly about biological differences there. But we also need to recognise that even there, people don't necessarily neatly fit into two boxes, and some people are, would fall into more of an intersex definition because they have a more mix of chromosomes, of hormones, and of genitals. So even biological isn't A or B. In terms of gender, usually we're looking there in terms of this more social cultural differences than those straight biological ones, which I think is maybe helpful in terms of when we're looking at some of these studies. You'll see some of the work I refer to. What's actually being tested in some instances is more biological differences, and in others it's more the social and the gender differences. And so there's a difference there in some of these studies I'll be referring to. And whilst there isn't a lot of this in my presentation, we absolutely have to recognise that gender doesn't sit there on its own. It absolutely intersects with other things. So, ethnicity, disability, age. It's very difficult just to sort of look at gender on its own. But nonetheless, this presentation probably does a bit of that, but we need to recognise it's not that straightforward. This is a World Health Organization definition, again, which is quite helpful. Talking about gender, referring to roles, behaviours, activities, attributes, opportunities that society considers appropriate for girls and boys, women and men. Interacts with, but different from the binary characteristics of biological sex. So we just need to sort of bear those in mind as we work through this. So, I mean, brains are amazing, and in terms of brain development, I think it's a really interesting area for us to reflect on. And again, if you read Gina's book, there's quite some interesting stuff there about how our brains develop. Obviously, incredibly complex, all these different areas that do different things. And her sort of basic question is, are biologically male and biologically female brains different? I think the overarching answer we seem to be at is nobody quite knows. There are some differences, but more predominantly they're very similar. So I think that's a very healthy message to give to young people, is that actually you're not predetermined and constrained because you're a male or female. They are very similar, very fluid, you know, and there's a real crossover between. However, you know, a girl and her brain will not follow the same journey as a boy. And one of the interesting things about brains is how they are not fixed. They are very fluid, really. And one of the particularly interesting things, and this science has developed and will continue to develop over, you know, over time, is just how plastic and malleable our brains are. So they are not fixed things. They are changeable. So at the age of 6, a brain is 90% of its adult size. But the interesting thing is the connections appear, disappear. They do stabilise and they get insulated, but these connections are this really interesting thing. And when you hear about pruning, that's what's going on with these connections. And it doesn't stop. So actually we do acquire new brain cells, even as we get older. We lose lots, but actually we do acquire new things. But it's these connections between brain cells that is the really interesting things. And what we find is actually, in terms of these connections, is that when babies are born, they have something like 2,500 connections from a neuron. That actually goes up to 15,000 as teenagers. And then as we get older, it goes down to 7,500, and this pruning takes place. And that's a lot around kind of, we're pruning out what we don't use. I thought it was interesting, and I've just been reading about kind of what makes a genius as well, because although this isn't necessarily gender specific, it kind of, again, in this capability argument, I think is really interesting. That's a picture of Einstein's brain, and they are doing some work on, you know, was his brain different to anybody else's? What makes a genius? And it's a really interesting question. And those 4 things have kind of been said: intelligence, being creative, perseverance. Well, that could easily be something that's socially determined, and also a bit of good fortune. And actually, in terms of, you know, people considered to be a genius, actually parents very often weren't a genius, so it's not always thought to be genetic. There were some studies, these ones done of 15,000 Californian children with IQs of 140 plus. A couple of people were excluded because they didn't match that, and then went on to win the Nobel Prize for Physics. So again, this kind of not fixed in time idea about potential is really interesting. Charles Darwin at the bottom there, you know, considered a very ordinary boy, rather below the common standard in intellect. That was kind of what was said of him. So again, you know, things do change, that's for sure. IQ and intelligence, not a constant. So actually it can increase, it can decrease. So I think a lot of you people have a kind of feeling that actually I'm pretty stupid, or I'm not very good at things. But actually, if you practice things, if you get those connections going, there's a lot of scope for improving performance and ability. And that shows sort of testing that it actually can go down by 20 points or up 20 points, 23 points for verbal, down 28 and up 17 for non-verbal. So there's quite a range there. Down at the bottom, there's a quote there. Now, some of you might have come across the work of Dr. Bruce Perry. There's quite, in Lincolnshire, his work has been quite well sort of represented through training, I know, for people like children's services staff, because he's looked at the effects of trauma and the effect on the brain, and it has significant effect on the brain. But he's also said, you know, neural networks, these connections form as a result of repetition. So maybe as a female, if we're not practicing certain things, we don't get that good at them. You know, there's more of a deficit. And the same with boys, if they're not exercising these parts of the brain, then sometimes these neural networks won't form. Doesn't mean it stays that way forever. And I think, again, a very positive message is these actually can be exercised and improved. But basically, there is a lot there about use. language quite a common area. So 2 years old, you know, a child would commonly be exposed to 600 words, but in another family, it might only be 150. So that part of the brain isn't quite so well developed. And we also know, you know, in some families, positive reward can make learning pleasurable, in others not. So although this isn't gender specific, I think it just shows about the exercising these parts of the brain and how important it is. Probably one of the most well-used pieces of research in terms of this idea that the brain is, you know, very malleable is the knowledge. Incredible thing, people have to learn 25,000 street names. You know, it almost, you know, beyond belief that the human brain can do that. But because it's such a specific learning task, neurologists have used people who've done the knowledge as quite interesting research specimens, if you like. And what they've found is, yes, the brain absolutely does change, and that there's a very clear increase in brain matter in these connections that actually happens, particularly in the areas of the brain that around spatial cognition and memory. And actually then when people retire or leave that profession, those networks disappear and those areas of the brain actually do shrink. So again, this idea of the brain being very changeable. Similarly with things like musicians, we see differences. So left-hand motor control area in the brain can be larger in string players, but in keyboard players on the right. Jugglers, again, another sort of little study that showed, again, an increase in grey matter, and the bigger the better, if you like. So actually when they found that the areas, those people whose brains changed the most were better jugglers. But after 3 months, if they didn't practice, it went back to normal. I suppose in terms of male and female, what we've shown is that actually there are some differences, and probably again this is down to social kind of exposure, is that boys tend to measure much better at, or not much better, can tend to measure better at things like spatial awareness. But where girls practice with things like Tetris, is one of that kind of video puzzle, their spatial awareness can improve too. So you can kind of make up a bit of the deficit for maybe things that you've not had the opportunity to try. Tetris is a really good example. I suppose what I'd never even really much thought about until I looked for this slide, you know, Game Boy. That was quite interesting. I think that it is obviously quite marketed at a particular gender, but still, that's it is something that brain, you know, capacity can change with things like that. So that's really just talking about that plasticity in Tetris. So the grey matter actually in the hippocampus is seen to increase. This is another piece of work. So I'd mentioned there was 2 books at the beginning, and one called The Mosaic Brain. And so slightly different take on things to Gina Miller and her work, but there is quite a lot of similarities there. And this piece of work on the mosaic brain was a study, quite a large study, which is always good. So 1,400 adults, 1,400 adults, and 116 regions of the brain were mapped and looked at. And what they found was there was probably only about 10 that showed more gender norms, but there was no neat binary guide. And what they found was that it's very much a pick and mix. So some men had some of those 10 areas of the brain which would have been more typically female. Some women had areas of the brain that probably would have scored more on the male side. So we are a big pick and mix. I think the other thing to say is that in a lot of the studies, what scientists like to do is find difference. You know, that's quite exciting for them when they come across something that's different. The majority of studies have actually found out with the brain that there's more similarity, but actually the ones often that get reported because it's more interesting and definitely make the papers are the one where the differences are. So, you know, I think this piece of work again is very interesting. and actually very positive in terms of the messages we can give young people. One of the, I suppose in terms of more of a social study, was to ask people what their preferences were. So people versus things. And this is a sort of thing that psychometrics measure. And at BGU, we do use psychometrics. But I guess, again, what you're measuring is where people are at a point in time. It's not necessarily that people are hardwired that way. This is the kind of big question still, you know, but people versus things, women tend to prefer the people side of things, and that would come up on interest inventories, whereas men tend to come up with the things. Well, clearly, if that's your interests, that already says what kind of careers that you might choose. So as a man, you know, there you've got sort of illustrations of technology, of cars, of planes, of things. Whereas with women, the people side, you know, that tends to, and I would absolutely, as a work as careers advisors at BGU, you know, you see it, people coming through the door regularly. What are the most important things to you in a career? I want to help people, females, you know, very commonly. I wouldn't like to put a percentage on it, but I would say very high. That's a particular driver for a lot of females. So that people versus things, it's been a huge study in these interest inventories, so 500,000 people. But, you know, as I said, that could be because it's a socially kind of biased preference rather than biologically based. The truth is we really don't know. And what you find is when you start and study these areas is it's quite divisive, and certainly when you read the commentary going on behind the screens, it certainly does sort of cause a lot of division in people's views. And, you know, you can't necessarily say there's a right or a wrong because there's still so many unknowns in this area, but it's incredibly fascinating. So in terms of this, looking more now at the social side, so self-esteem is quite determined about really, I suppose, how we fit in, how do we embed in the groups that we find ourselves. So, you know, obviously one of the groups would be our preferred gender group. And there are actually close parallels between brain activity when you look at kind of social pain and where people are excluded and physical pain. So there's a huge driver there for us to fit in. And Gina Rippon talks a lot about gender detectives. So babies from not long after they've born are these kind of rule hungry scavengers. They're looking for the rules. They're looking for how they should fit in. They're looking at how they should be. And so this self-esteem is quite a driver. And first things they may turn their attention to are things like, you know, what are their friendship groups? How are they going to fit in there? What are they being bombarded with in terms of the media? What kind of toys are they given access to? Clothes? Definitely in terms of, you know, lots of studies that are showing boys and girls are treated differently by maybe the same, you know, parents who have a boy and a girl. There is a different kind of parental styles. Another interesting one is things like early years education. So we may have some, you know, predominantly single parents, would be female, children, you know, in early years education, going into nurseries will predominantly be cared for by female staff. Only 3% of staff in early years settings are male, which is another probably great shame. Gender is so significant to people, and these to the point that, you know, it's a big deal even before a baby's born. You know, what sex is this baby going to be? So loads of all these products out there that even, you know, 2 months before a baby's born, it becomes really significant. So before a baby's born, you know, there's this experience, babies are experience ready, and actually receiving all this information, even at 3, you know, 25% are actually online daily. And Gina talks about this kind of pink frilly dress phenomenon, and this pinkification, this kind of exposure, particularly for girls, in terms of all this pink. So that's, you know, quite a common toy that a child might be exposed to. I found this quite an interesting one. There's STEM Barbie. You know, is this a help? There's kind of an attempt to sort of say, well, STEM's for girls as well. But the ironic thing is clearly the role model there, which is this blonde, apparently would be 6 foot tall, and have a 6-inch smaller waist than the average woman, maybe isn't something that a lot of females would identify with. But I guess it's an attempt, and, you know, toy manufacturers will obviously try and sell what they think will sell. There's some examples out there for boys as well. So, okay, bit of an attempt. There's a barber shop rather than a hairdresser's, but okay. So, you know, there is a start there. One of the areas I've found quite interesting is in terms of gender is this stereotype threat. And it's easy to sort of think of ourselves and whether this, you know, whether this actually has an impact. So if you can imagine, maybe you're learning to do a hobby that's quite typically male, or a male's doing something that's quite typically female, like dancing, for example. There is some evidence that we can begin to overthink things. So imagine yourself as a female trying to learn to play golf, and I can remember this with alongside 2 males. What it can be quite difficult to do sometimes is focus on the task. So I think because you're quite conscious, there might be an inner voice going, oh, I don't think I'm going to be very good at this. Actually, quite some of the brain's energy is used up in monitoring, this self-monitoring, checking for mistakes, and the effects of stress. So it can be quite challenging. I don't know if you can imagine yourself into that situation, but it's not always straightforward. And and this isn't always gender related at all. I mean, I've got 2 daughters, and I can remember the experience of both of them trying to water ski. One was up on skis like very quickly. The other just felt she couldn't do it. And I think probably my daughter who could, it was because she practiced that area of the brain. She did gymnastics. She had something quite transferable. Whereas my other daughter said, I haven't got any balance. Well, you probably have, you just haven't practiced that. So again, I think this is a really interesting area. We've probably all tried things and given up at the first go, when actually, if we kept going and we practiced and we helped our brains develop, we probably can do things a lot better than we think we can. It's about motivation, I suppose. And if you really want to do something, then it's worth sticking at it, practicing. And the chances are you will get better. There isn't physically anything stopping you necessarily from improving your performance. Now, what I'm hoping to do is go on to do more research about women and men in non-stereotypical roles and look at why that's happened. You know, what's different from them to the majority of people. From some of my first research, desk-based research, what starts to become obvious is, probably not surprisingly, is that there's a range of factors. There was a group of physicists who were involved together in a chat forum, and they all started to say, oh, you know, I think we actually did all play with a lot of boys' toys as young children, and that seemed to be quite a common theme. So perhaps non-stereotypical parenting. So one of a physicist again was saying that she can remember her mum playing with her and doing quite a lot of sciencey things. There's some evidence that quite a lot of women who've gone into non-stereotypical roles maybe had older brothers, and as a result, more exposure to kind of boys' toys and that sort of environment. With others, it might be there's something actually captured their imagination. So there was an astrophysicist who got into a certain type of novel just a bit by chance. So it was a bit of kind of happenstance thing. And, you know, that kind of developed that area of interest. There are a couple that I've read, particularly senior women in IT, who thought it was a great move in terms of economic reasons, and they'd had difficult childhoods. One said that dad had left, and you know, she realised how vulnerable her mum had been because she didn't have the kind of career that could support the family. And so this woman sort of strived to go into this area pretty much because she thought it was a good bet financially. So what I'm interested in looking at is you know, what kind of typography, why is it that men and women choose non-stereotypical roles? So in terms of the curriculum currently, and I'd be very interesting to hear from some of you, if you know, in terms of what is happening in schools. But, you know, certainly from some of the initial looking that I've done, you know, it is embedded in subjects, particularly A level. So clearly psychology and English, it kind of varies a little bit depending on what courses are chosen and how representative they are. History, there is a bit of work clearly done around maybe suffragists and Boudica, and there's kind of examples there. And in the sort of more PSHE arenas are things done around discussions around gender pay gap, you know, career choice type activities, which might be, you know, trying to get young people to sort of say what they think the stereotypical jobs are, and discussion around that. And some evidence of positive role models being brought into school or discussed. So there's stuff going on, and there may well be a lot more than that. But from some of the research and the reading I've been doing, I think what would be interesting is perhaps to share some of these ideas about brain development, if that's not already being done, to look at this idea that, you know, you're not a fixed, hardwired entity, but there is a lot of scope for development, for trying new things. You know, opportunities are broader. It is kind of the structure of society that does make things difficult for boys and girls to step outside of what's expected. And the truth is, very often it's probably harder for a boy to step out. You know, for a girl to step into engineering may be quite socially acceptable. For a boy to step into being, you know, working in a nursery or being a hairdresser or being a dancer has often been socially less acceptable. So actually it's quite an interesting area. And if we can look at some of these, this brain development, this idea of children developing as these gender detectives, I think there's some interesting work there. And what I'm hoping is that Gina Rippon has said she would help us perhaps develop some curriculum materials that we could look at in that area. There's perhaps some work in terms of how careers are presented. So we know that perhaps engineering becomes more attractive to women if it is portrayed in a more people way. And that's why, you know, within STEM, there's huge differences within STEM. As we've seen, a lot of females go into biology, and there's much more of a balance in medicine, for example. But when we're getting into production and engineering, it's very different. So STEM isn't one thing. There's a huge variety of differences within STEM. But actually in some of those areas that are underrepresented, if we can show how you know, engineering makes a difference to society, and look at the social good of the profession, then perhaps that becomes more attractive. And we need to think that in terms of, you know, looking at both sides of the argument. So developing materials that are not just aimed at female or males. As I said, we're hoping to develop a curriculum pack over the next year, and also work with employers. So, you know, we know it's very, very difficult perhaps for a woman to go into a purely male environment. It's not always very well set up. It's not very attractive. And similarly for males to go into a purely female environment, there are challenges there. So working with employers, thinking through some of those questions, I think, are useful to do. And there are employers that want to do that because they would really welcome having more representation. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation. Now, I'm not sure if I can see this chat or not, but if there are any questions, I'd be very happy to take them either now or after. You can contact me on alison.webb@bishopg. Just see if I can close that down. Okay. Okay, there's certainly some areas on the chat there, but just looking if there's any particular questions. Okay, so there's a sort of an area there about common sense, and I can kind of understand what you're saying there. How would it help me in my role? Well, I just hope it's kind of an interesting perspective that I would hope that we can, if you don't already, that we can share with young people, to say that we're not predetermined. I think that however much we've recognised that that people have different experiences, I think that behind a lot of this, people perhaps think, despite that, actually men and women are different, and so we need to accept that. And I think probably quite a lot of young people maybe feel that way. So I suppose by explaining a bit about the biology and the background, hopefully what we're saying is that you're not predetermined. So I think that's really my key point. Okay. Right, so I say I've looked through, there's certainly a lot of comments there, probably not so many questions, but just like to say thank you very much for your, for listening, and be very, very interested if you want to work with us moving forward in terms of being part of studies, helping with curriculum packs. If we can run stuff past you, that would be really, really valuable. So thank you very much.